This is WorkSpan TV. I'm Ryan Johnson from World at Work. We're going to talk today about driving performance through sales compensation. And I'm joined by CEB's Anna Krasniewska Shahidi. Anya, welcome.
Thank you.
Let me get right into it. So you're saying today that we should be paying more attention to pay perceptions, perhaps, than the actual amount of pay. Now, talk about your research that's getting at this.
So the reason that we say that is because pay perceptions are actually linked much more closely to changes in performance rather than just adding additional pay. That might have been what companies have done in the past. If we wanted sales teams to perform better, then we would add more compensation, but that's not a particularly efficient way to go about it. In fact, if we think about an average sales employee, if we wanted them to move from 95% to 105% of goal, we would basically have to double their variable pay, which really isn't realistic for a lot of companies. And it's not, as I mentioned, particularly efficient. A better way to think about it is to design around the perceptions. When we do so, then we can increase performance by about 11.5% for an average employee, but without increasing cost. So that's pretty remarkable.
So obviously, if you're talking about perceptions, you need to be able to measure the perceptions, and then you need to be able to improve the perceptions.
Well, yes and no. In terms of measurement, what we've done is to already complete a study in terms of what types of pay plan design elements are tied to a change in perception, so that you know already what is the best level or what is the best way to think about that design instead of having to measure it yourself. Certainly organizations can measure it so that they get a much more specific answer, but for those organizations who don't have the time or resources, we already have some guidelines in place in order to make sure that they get the most out of their designs.
Okay, so let's talk about the second part of that then. How do you actually improve someone's perception of their own pay?
When we think about pay perception, there are three categories. The first is the fairness of the pay plan. So does the employee think that they're getting in return what they put in? The second is around the risk component. So is the level of risk or the amount of pay at risk the right amount for that particular employee? And the third one is around the complexity. So is the pay plan something that the employee can understand? From a salesperson's component, the easiest way to think about this is as they make their way out to, say, the parking lot or through the elevator, can they calculate how much they have riding on the back of a successful sale?
How should companies be thinking today about payout curves in terms of their sales comp design?
Well, that's an interesting question because we get that from companies quite a bit, and companies oftentimes want to know what's the single curve or what's the right way to think about it, and really a better way to think about it is to divide up the curve into different zones. So really, what is the right slope of the curve based on the type of performance that we're trying to achieve? Now, typically what companies do is that they reserve the steepest part of the curve for their highest performing employees. But what's interesting here is that the steepest part of the curve should be reserved more for employees who are trying to get from about 95% of their goal to 105% of their goal. And in fact, when we move, if we split that up even a little more, as employees get from 100 to 105% of goal, that should be about twice as steep as when they go from 95 to 100. So really what we want to do is to get sales employees to get to goal, and then we want them to get just a little bit further past goal. For those who are our highest performers, our best performing sales employees, we actually have to start to look a little bit further beyond just traditional incentives, beyond traditional variable pay, in order to keep that motivation up because of some of the diminishing returns that we see.
Anya, we've talked a little bit about individual sales incentives and performance incentives. Talk to me about team-based incentives. How are those working today? And can you really drive team behavior and team performance through sales incentives? Or is that better done with other vehicles?
Yeah, so absolutely you can drive team-based behaviors or collaboration through compensation incentives. However, the way that most companies have it structured, it's not working particularly well for them. A better way to think about it is to, if we're going to have team-based performance measures, two separate factors need to be in place. The first is that we need to think about the team-based performance measure in relation to the size of the team. So basically, the bigger the team, the bigger the size of the weighting of the performance measure. We want to make sure that that's proportionate. The second thing to keep in mind is that if we're going to have a team-based measure, so a group result that someone is measured on, we want to measure them more on the individual's contribution to that result as opposed to whether the team just got it yes or no. So really moving beyond just having kind of a check the box on the team-based measure to really what did the individual contribute. Those two things are what come in play into making a team-based measure successful.
We've talked a little bit about the design. If we can shift over now to the implementation, in a lot of companies, compensation doesn't own the sales comp. So what advice would you give executives in that situation?
And if the compensation function doesn't own sales compensation, they're in pretty good company. What we found is that that's true for about 80% of organizations, which leaves compensation functions in a bit of a tough spot when it comes to the implementation side of all of these design recommendations. And what we found is that really for a compensation function, it's really more about their involvement rather than whether they own a plan. And in fact, when the compensation function is highly involved, we see the revenue growth of that organization go up by about 8%. In organizations where the compensation function isn't involved, that revenue growth is about 3% or just over 3%. So pretty good business case for the involvement of the compensation function. But if they're going to be involved, they have to keep in mind two things. The first is that they have to think about their influence, because for many organizations, the compensation function doesn't necessarily always have the credibility with the sales function. So really getting to know the business so that the recommendations that they're putting in place really resonate with the sales function. And the second thing to keep in mind is how they're going to scale their help, because at the end of the day, most compensation teams are fairly small, but sales design plans are very many, and they certainly have other things on their plate. So they really have to think about how they're going to move from more of a one-to-one consulting model to more of a one-to-many. How can they scale their influence across the organization so that they can really make that impact?
Some really provocative thoughts here about how to increase performance and financial outcomes through sales compensation. I'm going to thank Anna Krasniewska Shahidi from CEB. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And for WorkSpan and World at Work, I'm Ryan Johnson.